welcome back to part 2 of the history of smallpox. Part 1 was about how smallpox came from America, actually, in defiance of all scientific and historical convention. Or was it? I guess you should watch that first to find out. Or don't, because we're moving on to part 2. What's part 2 about? Well, you may not know this, but smallpox doesn't exist anymore. Asterisk. It's been eradicated from the world back in the 1970s. It's the only human disease to be eradicated from the world, in fact, although we're pretty close with polio. How did we pull that off? Will we ever be able to do it again? Let's discuss in this special video on the history of smallpox. Part 2. You would think that natural immunity to infectious diseases is a newfangled concept, what with all the science and other nerd stuff it involves, if you actually want to grasp how it works. It turns out, it's not. And that's not surprising. People are good at spotting patterns, and if there's one pattern people have spotted over and over and over, is that there are several diseases you get once and never again. Remember Al-Razi? No? Okay, I'll remind you. A doctor lived circa 900, described the clinical characteristics of smallpox and how it's different from measles. Cool dude, basically. Well, he pointed this fact out. He wasn't the first, not by 1,000 years, and he wouldn't be the last. People wouldn't understand why for a long time, and theories ranged from divine favor to body fluid disorders to spiritual imbalance. I'll save my favorite theory for a fun fact later down the line. Except not. This video, or this script, has gone on way too long, and we're not doing fun facts. There are no fun facts to be had here today. We're just gonna blitz through this, so maybe I'll do it in a short or something like that. But what I'm saying is that medicine was historically a field of study driven by observation, and it still basically is. We're not intrinsically any better at it than Al-Razi was 1,000 years ago, we just have better equipment. People understood that smallpox was infectious, even if they didn't understand why, and people understood that once you got it once, you never got it again. People also noticed, especially in Asia, that some cases of smallpox were severe and potentially deadly, whereas some were quite mild. And that gave someone a thought. What if we take infectious material from the mild smallpox cases, scabs, clothes, etc., and use it to selectively give the mild smallpox to others who haven't had it yet? The origin of that idea is lost to time. I made a short on it, which I'm just gonna stick in here. Skip ahead to this time code if you've already seen it, but I spent a lot of effort on MS Paint to make it, so by God, you are going to watch it. Here we go. The year is 3700, and a doctor enters a house a few hours after dusk. The family living there sought this man out specifically. They have heard from a relative that smallpox had broken out in a nearby village, and they want to make sure their young son is protected. This physician claims to know a secret ritual, one that will protect the child from the worst effects of the disease, a ritual that in our time we call vaccination. The physician has already harvested scabs from a smallpox victim in exchange for coin or perhaps as part of the price for treatment. He has dried these scabs out and crushed them into powder, mixed, perhaps, with his own proprietary blend of medicine. Now, he approaches the child and, using a long pipe, blows the powder into the child's nose. Coin is exchanged, and the doctor departs. This ritual is carried out in secret. The physician does not want his competitors learning of his methods. He will never publish his methods and will pass them on only to his students, likely members of his own family. The family of the patient fears that their neighbors will discover what they have done. This ritual will cause their son to develop smallpox, and although it will be a far milder and less deadly form of the disease, the child will still be infectious, putting the community at risk. So, they will sequester their son for several weeks and make excuses. And while it sounds like I'm describing some sort of horrible, dystopian, yet increasingly likely future, I'm just using the traditional Chinese calendar. Hey, the year is actually 1000 AD, roughly, and the procedure I just described is one of the first historical vaccinations. Asterisk. If you want to learn more, I'm doing a 2-part series on the mysterious origins of smallpox, as well as the history of its eradication. So, check out those videos. Cool, huh? Yep, that was the first vaccine, asterisk. Please don't actually me in the comments. I am fully aware it's called variolation, and every article you will read about it online will spend a paragraph distinguishing variolation and vaccination, but that is a 19th century distinction, and we'll get to why. In modern terms, based on how we understand infectious disease and immunity, this is a vaccine. A live viral attenuated vaccine, to be specific. The point of any vaccine is to teach the immune system something, typically to teach it to fight something dangerous by showing it something safe. Well, hopefully safe. Safe-ish? Okay, it wasn't very safe. Which brings me to one of my favorite types of sections, X reasons variolation didn't catch on in a big way for 700 years. Doctors hate them. Reason 1. I mentioned the secrecy around medical culture at the time, particularly in China. If you were a doctor, other doctors were not your friends, they were your competitors. Reason 2, it was dangerous. Like 1 in 100 people who get variolated die, kinds of dangerous. Variolation gives you smallpox. Hopefully mild smallpox, but even a mild smallpox can kill, sometimes. A lot of people would be reluctant to get variolated, and a lot of doctors would hesitate to take up the practice. Reason 3, community pressure. Like I mentioned, variolation gives you smallpox, and smallpox is infectious and can spread to the community. This isn't a hypothetical risk. In the 19th century, when the practice became better documented, there were multiple instances of variolated individuals causing localized epidemics. People who got infected by a variolated person typically had regular deadly smallpox, not mild disease. We'll talk about why later. Reason 4, it's a pain, like procedurally and logistically. You need a smallpox patient available to you, then you need to take tissue samples from their pox. Then you have a limited amount of time to variolate someone else. I've never been able to figure out how long a tissue sample remains infectious once dried, but it, depending on the climate and the temperature, can probably be between several weeks to several months. And finally, reason 5. Prior to the 16th century and the emergence of the variola major strain, smallpox just wasn't that dangerous. Why variolate against something that, in the slightly paraphrased words of Al-Razi, was considered to be a normal part of puberty? So the first vaccine quietly sat on the shelf, so to speak, used periodically but not entering the medical zeitgeist. At least not until the 16th century. Not until variola major. In part 1 of this historical retrospective, I talked about how deadly smallpox actually was throughout history, and not very, and how variola major changed all that. You should go watch that video. It's got like 20 views. That's the best I've done outside some stupid ass shorts. I'll give you the TLDR anyway. Sometime around 1500, smallpox changed in a big way and became a lot deadlier, causing crises all over Europe and spreading outward through the sea trade. Unsurprisingly, and likely directly in response to this, the practice of variolation began to gain prominence. The methods for variolation spread westward from China and India, where they were already common knowledge in the 1500s, along the Silk Road. By 1600, variolation was commonplace in the Ottoman Empire, which controlled most of the land adjacent to the southern and eastern Mediterranean Sea. Great Britain, which it might surprise you to learn, was at that time not a quaint little middle-income country, but in fact a genuine world power, was in a somewhat unique position at the turn of the 18th century. It boasted not only a plethora of sources of information through its extensive diplomacy and trade networks, but also a dedicated and government-sponsored academic society, the Royal Society of London, which held frequent meetings and shared and passed on information between their members and scientific colleagues on the continent through correspondence. The first rumblings of investigating variolation in the Royal Society occurred around 1700, when the letters describing the practice began arriving from China, and a Dr. Clopton Havers gave a short report about the practice in a meeting. But British physicians and the Royal Society members didn't start seriously considering the practice until they were browbeaten into it by this angry upper-class British woman, or so the story goes. Okay, in actuality, additional reporting about variolation in the Ottoman Empire from Dr. Emanuele Timoni around 1714 finally spurred the Royal Society to take serious action and formally instruct their members to investigate the practice further. Dr. Timoni was the personal physician to the British ambassadorial family in Constantinople, by the way, which is to say the Lord and Lady Montagu, which brings us back to this angry upper-class British woman who was, in fact, Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She likely learned about variolation from Dr. Timoni and became a strong advocate for it, writing about it in a letter to her friend Sarah in 1717, which I'm going to read to you in the most obnoxiously fake British accent I can manage. All right, are you ready for this? Okay, let's go. I am going to tell you a thing I'm sure I am going to tell you a thing that I am sure will make you wish yourself here. The smallpox, so fatal and so general among us, is here entirely harmless by the invention of ingrafting. I am patriot enough to take pains to bring this useful invention into fashion in England, and I should not fail to write to some of our doctors very particularly about it, if I knew any one of them that I thought had virtue enough to destroy such a considerable branch of their revenue for the good of mankind. God, that was awful. Oh, shit. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But, it's nice to know some things never change, Anyway, Lady Montagu had two of her children variolated and used her connections to help popularize the practice. Meanwhile, in the British colony town of Boston, reports of variolation reached a man named Cotton Mather. He was some sort of religious leader by profession, but was nevertheless highly scientifically literate and had a strong interest in medicine, which was not unusual for the time. When smallpox broke out in Boston in 1721, he persuaded a friend and physician, Zabdiel Boylston, to start variolating people. This caused a massive controversy and started a political fight between the city's clerical leadership, who were generally pro-variolation, and the city's doctors, who wanted the practice banned. Yeah, weird, right? Variolation was banned, in fact, but Boylston continued to do it anyway, and Mather continued to advocate for it, despite death threats and a literal assassination attempt via bomb. Boylston and Mather published their results, claiming natural smallpox infection in Boston killed about 14% of its victims, while variolation killed only 2%. This heralded a boom for variolation in the American colonies, but also the birth of the anti-vax movement, as many laymen and medical professionals continued to resist the idea due to its very apparent and obvious danger. One notable anti-vax writer referred to the parable of Job to claim that Satan himself was the first vaccinator. It's nice to know some things never change, Okay, but now we interrupt your history with science. I described the ancient Chinese method of variolation performed by blowing smallpox through a tube up a subject's nose. By the 17th century, this practice changed to cutting a subject and exposing them to dried scab material, or smallpox pus from lesions. This was how variolation had been practiced in India for centuries and was safer than the nasal method. Believe it or not, smallpox worked kind of like a respiratory disease. While the skin pox had plenty of virus and were contagious, most of the virus was produced in the oropharynx, that's the nose and mouth area, and spread through droplets in the air when somebody talked or sneezed. So the typical natural mode of infection by smallpox was by breathing in infectious particles. This let smallpox quickly get in and replicate in the lymphatics adjacent to the lungs. If you want to know what the lymphatics are and why infection in them is bad, check out my anthrax video. Anyway, in contrast to respiratory infection, skin infection of smallpox stayed localized for longer and spread throughout the body slower. This gave the immune system a critical few days head start before the disease progressed to the systemic stage. This, in turn, resulted in milder, more survivable disease. However, if our hypothetical variolated person infected somebody else through the respiratory method, that second person would have the regular severe disease, which was why variolation was still dangerous from a community perspective. Okay, back to the history. Cotton Mather's impact on variolation in Europe is unclear, though he, like Lady Montagu, wrote a lot of letters. But around the same time, England was having its own smallpox epidemic, and the royal family pushed the Royal Society and the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons to do something about it. After all, smallpox was killing important and well-to-do people, and not just the poors. And we can't have that now, can we? So, Hans Sloane, court physician to the royal family, head of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons, and member of the Royal Society, discussed the option of variolation for the children of the then Prince and Princess of Wales and future King and Queen, George Augustus and Caroline of Ansbach. They were not 100% sold on it, which is understandable, which is when Hans Sloane decided to do some science. Okay, so it's 1721, and you're Hans Sloane. Smallpox is sweeping the land. The royal family fears for their children. Oh no! You've heard of this newfangled variolation procedure that's supposed to protect you. You might have heard of Lady Montagu or read one of the letters from Cotton Mather, maybe containing some of his preliminary results. But you've also probably heard how things can go wrong. So you have doubts. But now you and the royal family have to make a decision. How do you inform that decision? With science! Yes, so the Princess of Wales persuaded her father-in-law, the king, to lend her a few condemned criminals to test out the procedure. If they survived the variolation, and in one case a follow-up exposure to smallpox, they would receive a pardon! Yay! How generous! All of the prisoners survived, but Sloane was still unsure. He was being asked to variolate children, but the prisoners were all adults. There was an outside risk of children being more vulnerable to variolation. So, the Princess of Wales persuaded her father-in-law, the king, to lend her a few orphans to test out the procedure. I don't know what they got in return, but a total of 17 kids got variolated, and they all survived. Which is good. Yay. The newspapers of the time ate that shit up. They called it the Royal Experiment due to the involvement of the royal family, even printing the locations where the kids can be found for viewing by a curious public. This convinced Caroline, and she ordered her children variolated. The procedure was supervised by one Charles Maitland, the man who variolated Lady Montagu's children, and one of the only British physicians of the time familiar with the procedure due to his previous post in Constantinople. We call this type of science a clinical trial. It's not the first of its kind. That credit goes to James Linn's experiments with scurvy 25 years later? Huh. Well, anyway, it was the first widely published and disseminated clinical trial of the early modern era, and the involvement of the British royals made it incredibly influential. By modern standards, however, this experiment does not hold up, because, you see, you may have noticed a few problems with it. A few big, glaring problems. I'm talking, of course, about the methodology. Firstly, not enough prisoners and orphans. You can't do a proper statistical analysis with an experimental group of 6 or 17. Secondly, what are you comparing the experimental groups to? Where are your controls? You need to expose some prisoners and orphans to smallpox the normal way to get a proper baseline death rate. Also, you need to leave some unvariolated because, thirdly, only one prisoner and one orphan in this experiment actually got re-exposed to smallpox. Sure, they didn't get smallpox, but that barely tells you anything. Every subject in the experiment needs to be re-exposed. It's this sort of sloppy science that really drives me up the wall.
Oh, and I guess we also have to follow the Declaration of Helsinki that sets strict limitations on fun.
Sets strict ethical standards for selecting subjects for experimental medicine. Also, it's hard to find enough orphans these days. By the late 1700s, variolation was a standard and in some cases government-mandated practice throughout Europe and most of its colonies, but smallpox remained a problem. And variolation wasn't exactly a great solution. Like, I hate to sound at all sympathetic to the anti-vax side, but if the COVID vaccine had a 2% chance of killing me, I might think about throwing a bomb in someone else's house too. Like Chuck's. Fuck that guy. Enter Edward Jenner. Jenner was a British physician who himself had been variolated as a child. He purportedly had a rather rough time after his variolation, and while he didn't die, obviously, it wouldn't be completely out of this realm to think that the experience left him with a better appreciation of the risks than some of his contemporary doctors. Nevertheless, he remained a firm proponent of the procedure, at least until he discovered something better. That something was cowpox. Cowpox is kind of like smallpox, but for cows. Hence the name. It's a virus. Same as smallpox, it's closely evolutionarily related to smallpox. And you know how I just said it's for cows? Well, that's a lie, actually. The primary carriers of the virus are probably rodents, but it can jump to cows as well as other animals such as, most importantly, people. By Jenner's time, farmers knew about cowpox, knew that coming into contact with it could give you a vesicular rash that goes away after a few weeks, knew that you could never get it again, and suspected that it provides immunity to subsequent infection by smallpox. That last observation sort of lived as folk wisdom for decades, and can't be credited to one individual. But the first person to take practical advantage of this, that we know of, was one Benjamin Justy, a farmer in 1774. Hearing that smallpox was spreading near his community, he took his wife and 2 sons to a neighbor's, pointed at an infected cow and said, presumably, rub. Later on, he exposed his now adult sons to a smallpox patient to prove that they were immune. If you're wondering why Justy isn't credited as the inventor of the vaccine, well, he actually kind of is. In 1805, the newly formed Jennerian Society officially recognized Justy as the first person to employ the cow inoculation method and demonstrate its effectiveness at preventing smallpox. If you're wondering why it's the Jennerian Society and not the Justy Society, and why history largely remembers Jenner, well, it's not because Jenner was original, but because Jenner put in the work. Like I mentioned, in 1796, rumors were circulating about the protective effects of cowpox among England's rural population. So Jenner decided to test the theory by performing a few variolations. But these variolations would be special. Instead of taking fluid from the pox of smallpox victims, he would take fluid from cowpox victims and variolate with that. He did this with 5 people, including a child whom he later variolated with smallpox by the standard method. The child did not develop any signs of even limited smallpox from the variolation, and Jenner concluded that this cowpox variolation procedure genuinely worked. He called the process vaccination, because Latin, to distinguish it from conventional variolation, and sent his findings to the Royal Society, who promptly told him to cut it out with his peasant nonsense because continuing this line of work would only destroy his reputation. I'm not sure what would have happened in a world where Jenner listened, but he did not. Instead, he vaccinated a bunch more people and then put his career and reputation on the line by publishing his results privately using his own funds. He aggressively advocated for the new procedure at the expense of his clinical practice and, to make a long story short, succeeded. He was also the man who figured out that cuckoos lay eggs in the nests of other birds, a fact that, at the time, was considered ridiculous and frequently cited by anti-vaxxers as a means to discredit Jenner, even though it had nothing to do with the science of vaccines. And it's nice to know some things never change, you know? Originally, the term vaccination referred specifically to the cow or arm-to-arm method of smallpox prevention with cowpox. But in the 19th century, microbiology legend Louis Pasteur promoted revising the term to mean any preventative inoculation against infectious agents. Thus, our modern understanding of the word. Interlude, time for an interlude. Interlude, the first vaccine was weird. Okay, so I want to interrupt your history with some science again, and take a minute to point out how astonishingly serendipitous the Jenner vaccine was, just from a scientific perspective. Firstly, it was 1800, and germ theory of disease is still decades away, so Jenner discovered something that works without any actual idea why it works. But that's just the appetizer. If you think about modern vaccines, they all basically rely on showing your immune system parts of the thing that you're being vaccinated against. Jenner used cowpox to vaccinate against smallpox. Those are 2 different viruses. I would have to download an entire microbiology and immunology textbook into your brain to explain how absolutely batshit insane that really is. The flu changes year to year so much that new vaccines need to be developed every single year. But here are 2 viruses separated by tens of thousands of years of evolution, and they cross-protect against each other. It is one of the most mind-blowing strokes of luck in the entire history of medicine, and nobody ever seems to point it out. So I just did. Now, back to the history. Part 5. Okay, so it's 1800s-ish, and you're a doctor who wants to produce and distribute this new vaccine thing. What do you have to do? Travel to the country and chase down a cow? Well, yeah, actually. So you probably need a friendly farmer on hand, and the cowpox fluid doesn't really stay infectious for more than a day or two, so you would have to administer it quickly. I hope your horse isn't in the shop for maintenance or whatever. But once you manage that part, it gets a little easier. Every person you vaccinate successfully will develop localized cowpox at the site of vaccination. So after that, you take that first person, pop one of the vesicles, take the fluid, and vaccinate someone else, and so on. This is called arm-to-arm vaccination and would be the primary method of vaccination used for the next 50 years. When the Spanish wanted to bring the vaccine over to their American colonies, they loaded up 20 orphans into a boat and used the arm-to-arm method to keep the virus alive for the journey. Again, I have to point out that the fact that you can't just order 20 orphans from Amazon these days is clear and indisputable evidence of the stark decline of society in the recent centuries. Like, it doesn't have to be the same day, Amazon. I am willing to grudgingly accept next-day delivery of my orphans. Perhaps I should write to Bezos very particularly about it. Anyway, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, vaccination. Yay. So the arm-to-arm method was, to use the technical medical term, kind of icky. It could spread diseases. I mean, that was actually the point, but I mean diseases that aren't cowpox, like viral hepatitis, syphilis, and other bacteria and viruses. Nevertheless, it was pretty much immediately obvious to everyone that vaccination was better than giving people smallpox through variolation. Russia, one of the earlier adopters of variolation as a standard public health measure, was also the first to ban it in 1805 in favor of vaccination, and other countries soon followed suit. Vaccination received official papal endorsement in 1818, and the clergy of Europe would proactively work to vaccinate their parishes. The early 19th century also saw the birth of the anti-vax movement, driven at the time primarily by liberal reformist and anti-authoritarian politics, and resistance to compulsory government vaccination policies. Ironically, some of these groups helped propagate the practice of compulsory isolation for infected individuals. Since the last time we visited America, a few British colonies decided to form their own country instead and call it the United States. Some dude named Thomas Jefferson personally advocated for spreading the new vaccine technology, and Parliament, but like the American one, passed the Vaccine Act, establishing the National Vaccine Agency to regulate vaccine distribution and address the prevalence of poor quality and outright fraudulent vaccine practices. Unfortunately, in 1821, one of the vaccine batches ended up being produced from actual smallpox, not cowpox, which caused a smallpox outbreak and a general uproar. The National Vaccine Agency was dismantled in favor of devolving the responsibility for vaccine distribution to these peculiar regional entities that Americans call states. Arm-to-arm vaccination remained the gold standard until the 1850s, when a British scientist figured out that adding glycerol to fluid harvested from cowpox vesicles increased its shelf life considerably. The short infectivity window of cowpox fluid was always the main barrier to producing the vaccine industrially in cattle, and now this practice took off in earnest. Circa 1850 was also roughly when people recognized that vaccination does not offer a lifelong protection against smallpox, and revaccinating adults entered standard practice. Key advancements that followed included refrigeration, development of potency testing and quality control methods, learning to grow the virus in eggs, which was way more sanitary, and finally, learning how to freeze-dry the vaccine into powder. This last part would be important for places like India, where the temperature could get hot enough to inactivate even the glycerol vaccine in 2 days. Oh, and people stopped using the cowpox virus to vaccinate, on accident. And we don't know how. Yeah, it's weird, but at some point, some individual donated a vaccine virus strain to some laboratory. This virus would later spread from lab to lab until it became the standard virus for development of modern vaccines by everyone. Because it worked. It just wasn't cowpox. It would come to be called vaccinia, and it's closely related to horsepox, which is very similar to cowpox, and apparently also worked just fine as a vaccine for smallpox. Apparently, the French vaccine effort of the 19th century used horsepox more than cowpox because cowpox was rare in France, so blame the French? Maybe? I don't know. One thing I should mention was that the vaccine was dangerous. Like, the modern people complaining about measles and mRNA vaccines would absolutely shit themselves if they had to deal with the side effect profile of the smallpox vaccine instead. It relied on infecting someone with a living and mildly pathogenic virus, and it was lethal for 1 to 2 per million people, and could cause hospitalizations in 50 to 100 per million, typically people with an unknown mild underlying immune deficiency. Also, it leaves a gnarly scar. As smallpox declined around the world, when and whom to vaccinate became a challenging risk-reward problem for national governments, and people started thinking. By the 1950s, smallpox had been virtually eliminated from the global north, but that didn't mean that these countries could stop their surveillance and vaccination programs, because the risk of reintroducing smallpox through migration, tourism, trade, etc. was very real. Think of it like measles today. It's technically eliminated in most developed nations, but cases keep cropping up, and so everyone needs to stay vaccinated. Unless measles is eradicated globally, then we can stop. Well, in 1958, one Viktor Zhdanov, infectious disease researcher, epidemiologist, and deputy minister of health for the USSR, reasoned just that. He called on the World Health Assembly, the governing body of the World Health Organization, to focus on global smallpox eradication. Today, he would have probably been laughed out of the assembly. In fact, just 6 years before, the first World Health Organization Director General made just such a proposal and was unceremoniously voted down. But for Zhdanov, this was something of a pet project, and he came prepared. He discussed advances in vaccine production, cold storage logistics, and surveillance, as well as successful efforts of multiple countries to eliminate smallpox entirely, including an ongoing pan-American effort. He also pointed out that even the countries that interrupt transmission need to continuously keep up surveillance and vaccination efforts to prevent imported epidemics, all of which cost time, effort, and cash. His proposal was adopted, and the global eradication effort began in earnest. Except not really. You see, we can divide the smallpox eradication effort into 2 distinct phases. The smallpox eradication program of 1958 to 1968, and the intensified smallpox eradication program of 1968 onwards. The intensified phase was the one that actually eradicated smallpox. And the first phase, well, while it wasn't a complete failure, it was something of a disappointment. The eradication program, as it was originally laid out, had a lot of fatal flaws. The first was simply cash, or maybe resource distribution more broadly. The WHO dedicated only a handful of full-time staff. I forget the figure, but it was like 2 dudes, and had an operating budget of something like $1 million a year. The plan was that major vaccine-producing nations would voluntarily donate vaccine, which did happen, and that national governments would then be responsible for using donated and locally produced vaccine to vaccinate 80% of the population. 80% being the back-of-the-napkin calculated figure that would presumably lead to smallpox dying out. Which brings us to problems 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. So problem 2, the plan. There was no plan. That was not a plan. 2 dudes and $1 million is not a plan. The WHO resolution called out its member countries and said, smallpox eradication, you should really get on that. Feel free to contact us for support, maybe, or donate some vaccine, maybe, or something. So from the public health perspective, nothing really changed for 10 years as countries just kept doing what they were always doing. In some cases, this was effective. In some cases, it wasn't. About 30 smallpox endemic countries managed to successfully interrupt transmission during this period, and the additional vaccine floating around certainly helped. The countries where smallpox presence was more substantial, that had worse health infrastructure, or which were using a flawed approach, continued to have smallpox. There was no real guidance beyond go vaccinate up to 80%. Which brings us to problem 3. The 80% figure is Bullshit. What's the real figure? There isn't one. Percent vaccination coverage is fundamentally the wrong approach. The real question to ask is, how many susceptible people do you need in an area for smallpox to sustain and propagate? Let's say that number is 100 susceptibles per square kilometer, or 2x2 blocks for our American listeners. That square kilometer could be a tiny village of 100 people, and 80% successful vaccination coverage would leave 20 susceptibles and theoretically prevent a smallpox epidemic. It could also be an urban center with 10,000 people living in it, and 80% successful vaccination coverage would leave 2,000 susceptibles, more than plenty for a smallpox epidemic. Oh, I keep saying successful vaccination. Why do I keep putting the emphasis on successful? Well, problem 4. The vaccine was frequently trash. While the USSR, US, and Europe were by this point producing thermostable freeze-dried vaccine, a lot of producers were still making liquid lymph vaccine. That is, to be clear, just viral exudate and pus scraped from the side of a cow or sheep infected with vaccinia. Without refrigeration, this kind of vaccine loses effectiveness in a week or two, but at tropical temperatures, it's more like 48 hours. Also, to have the best effect, you would need to get the vaccine into the skin, not over, not under, which is actually trickier than it sounds. So vaccination tools and methods also varied in effectiveness. The Indian rotary lancet was so rough that vaccinators literally had to chase people down. So you vaccinated someone, but did you actually do it successfully? You don't know. Nobody knows. Nobody knows anything because problem 5, nobody knows what's going on and there's no consistent reporting of anything. The approach, if you could call it that, was just to send out vaccinators with vaccine and hope the problem solved itself. Mostly, it didn't. Vaccinators reported their numbers, but those don't really mean much without context. Where did you vaccinate? Who did you vaccinate? Sometimes people got vaccinated multiple times when they didn't need to because they were around and were convenient to vaccinate, like school kids who can be expected to show up every year to school. Sometimes the numbers got fudged, like what Brazilian authorities discovered after a major outbreak in a region where the number of vaccinations reported was higher than the actual population in the region. Oh, and half the people were never actually vaccinated. Cases of smallpox themselves weren't being reported to central authorities because there was no policy in place, or the central authorities didn't consider it important to track, or because you could get fired for reporting because if smallpox was around, you clearly weren't doing a good job vaccinating. Boy, it sure would be good to have some sort of central, dedicated reporting team and the resources to support them, but there aren't because problem 1, there's not enough cash. And there's not enough cash because problem 6, the fucking malaria eradication assholes. Yeah, so smallpox was not the first disease the world collectively joined together to eradicate. That honor goes to malaria. And at the time that smallpox eradication was getting started, the malaria eradication team was eating up most of the WHO's resources. If smallpox eradication can be considered one of the WHO's greatest successes, malaria eradication was its most bitter failure. Explaining the malaria efforts and why they failed would be a deep dive of its own, but for today, I can just say that the program was resource hungry and did not play well with others. The malaria teams basically refused to cooperate with any other health initiative, and in the case of Ethiopia, literally undercut the rest of the WHO by petitioning the government not to put any effort into smallpox eradication programs so they could have all the resources. Like, I called them the fucking malaria eradication assholes at the start of this section, and that is very much the subtext whenever the malaria program is mentioned by contemporary reports. It's not even deep subtext. Like, the official WHO retrospective on the smallpox eradication program gives this delightful quote. Nevertheless, the malaria eradication program indirectly made major contributions to the development of the successful intensified smallpox eradication program by demonstrating the fallacy of two premises. Then the report goes on to list how much the malaria eradication program sucked. Anyway, there were other problems, and the yearly World Health Assembly meetings began to grow more and more pessimistic, with delegates complaining that the program was going off track. By this point, it was clear that the malaria program was failing, and everyone had a vested interest to make sure that the smallpox program didn't fail as well. And so, the Director General laid out a new plan, and the new intensified smallpox eradication program was born. The changes to the old and new program weren't massive on the surface. The new program would have more funding as well as more staff, but whereas the old program was primarily passive, working at the WHO level as a distribution hub for donated vaccine and money, the new program would be more interventionist, with health operatives proactively engaging with partner governments to develop and improve eradication efforts, as well as to identify and solve problems. The overall strategy also changed. Instead of trying to meet a flat vaccination percentage target, eradicators shifted to rapidly identifying and containing smallpox outbreaks at the level of individual villages or city districts. The credit to pioneering this strategy goes to William Fagey, who argued that this was a far more effective use of limited vaccine doses than region-agnostic mass vaccination campaigns. He deployed this strategy to good effect in West Africa, and it became instrumental in clearing smallpox from India, which was seen as the most difficult barrier to overcome for global eradication. The last naturally occurring case of smallpox was reported in Somalia in 1977. What followed was a tense few years of surveillance efforts, but with no new cases discovered, the disease was officially declared eliminated in 1980. It was a truly monumental achievement, requiring international cooperation on a level not seen before or since. It cost $2.5 billion in today's money, and continues to save billions of dollars per year just from the virtue that we don't have to deal with smallpox surveillance and vaccination. It was the first human disease eradicated from the planet, and unfortunately, it was also the last. I hate to end this on a downer note, but it's been 45 years since the WHO declared smallpox eradicated, and we haven't managed to eliminate one single other infectious human disease. This despite the meteoric advances in biology and infectious disease research. So, what happened? Well, for one, smallpox was a bit special. It spread slowly, only by human-to-human transmission. It was highly visible and obvious to diagnose. It didn't have a prodromal infectious phase. That is, you weren't infectious until you could see the spots, whereas a lot of other diseases are infectious before they make you sick. It had an effective preventative tool available in the form of a vaccine, and finally, it was dangerous enough, and dealing with it was difficult and expensive enough that basically everyone felt that it was a priority. All of this made eradication feasible and justified the money and effort to achieve it. I think it's fair here to ask the question whether disease eradication should ever be a global goal. And the answer is yes, obviously. Dumbass. But there is some nuance in here, all right? There are plenty of important health problems that are not communicable diseases, and even with communicable diseases, different countries may be concerned about different things. Saving 10,000 lives from smallpox in India during the eradication period may have costed the resources to save 40 or 50,000 lives lost due to cholera during the same period. It pays off eventually, but the consideration of eventually is frequently second place to the consideration of now. And you can't eradicate cancer or heart disease or preterm birth, but you absolutely can reduce the burden of those problems with consistent, dedicated effort and funding. Reading between the lines of my source material makes me suspect that a lot of public health advocates who felt ill-used by the focus on the malaria and the smallpox eradication efforts began to push back hard from outside and inside the WHO for the organization to promote an integrationist philosophy of using limited resources to do as much as possible as efficiently as possible, rather than to focus on one disease at a time. There are genuinely good faith arguments to be made here about prioritization and resource allocation, but I can't help feel that there was some natural and very human bitterness to go along with this from people who felt that they or their passion projects were being overlooked in favor of the flashier and sexier concept of eradication. The WHO, in all fairness, did not completely abandon disease eradication. It continues to run a handful of eradication programs, and there's some hope that a few diseases like polio will be completely eliminated in the coming decades. But there is very little fanfare to these programs, and hardly any international interest, without which I think the WHO's more ambitious efforts will fail. maybe that's fine. I think it would be reductive and wrong to measure the success of global health initiatives purely by the number of eradications under their belts. But then I think about how 45 years ago, smallpox was eradicated globally when restriction enzyme mapping was the cool new thing in genetics, and this smallpox spork represented a quantum leap advancement in vaccination technology, all for a combined budget of roughly what Amazon spends yearly on marketing. And I get a little sad.